What do you think of when you think science fiction? Space battles, starships, robots, and aliens? That's definitely part of the science fiction genre, but it's actually a lot broader than that, and it has a surprisingly long history. You might think that science fiction is a fairly new genre, and I can understand why you would think that. In fact, before I started doing my research for this video, I thought that as well. I assumed that it started probably in the 19th century. However, it actually goes back even to the ancient world. Now, the stories in the ancient world that are considered to be sort of predecessors to science fiction are obviously very different from modern science fiction novels or even 19th century ones. But there are stories going back that far that deal with science fiction concepts like aliens and time travel. I know, shocking, right? One very well-known piece of ancient literature that I actually found out is considered sort of a predecessor to the science fiction genre is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, I haven't read it. From what I understand, it's a flood story similar to the one in Genesis in the Bible. I'm not sure what about it specifically makes it a science fiction or proto-science fiction kind of story, but I saw it come up a lot of times. Another example that I came across was a work called Verae Historae. I think I'm saying that right, I'm not entirely sure. It translates to True Histories, and it involves basically what amounts to an interplanetary war between people from the sun and the moon. Now, obviously, nowadays we know that there are no people living on the sun or the moon, but that kind of idea of there might be life beyond this planet, that's very much a science fiction idea. An 8th century Japanese work called Urashimo Taro explores the idea of time travel. And the legend of Atlantis also bears a lot of resemblances to science fiction. A lot of our ideas about Atlantis actually do involve the concept of lost science or technology that was never recovered or took a long time to reinvent. Obviously, these ancient legends and literatures are very different from what we would consider to be science fiction today, or even the early modern science fiction works of the 19th century. However, it does show that from the earliest recorded history, we were thinking about concepts similar to what's now explored in science fiction. Another work I saw referenced many times when I was looking for early examples of science fiction was Gullivers Travels by Jonathan Swift. The story, again, is not a science fiction novel as we know it, but apparently one of the societies that Gulliver encounters on his travels is basically a society of scientists. So that does sort of fit with the idea of speculative science or science beyond what we know about being done in the present day. In 1818, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, which is often cited as the first real science fiction novel, in that it really revolves around questions relating to science that's not possible in the modern day. The main character, Victor Frankenstein, is a scientist, and the whole story revolves around what he creates in his science lab and the fallout of that, and all of the ethical questions that surround creating life through scientific means. In some ways, Frankenstein is more similar to stories about cloning or artificial intelligence than it is to typical horror movie monster stories. Even though, due to many film adaptations that are not very faithful at all to the book, that is generally what people think of Frankenstein as. Two other very well-known 19th century science fiction writers were Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Their writings both are obviously predecessors of the science fiction novels that followed, but they are very different in terms of style and content. Jules Verne wrote basically adventure stories. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea follows a submarine that travels a long distance underwater. Journey to the Center of the Earth was about an expedition underneath the Earth's surface. There was a huge amount of science in them, and obviously science has changed, our understanding of the natural world has changed, and something like a long submarine voyage would no longer be considered impossible or something that we haven't yet been able to achieve. But for the time, they were very scientific compared to other novels. H.G. Wells was known for writing books like The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, and The War of the Worlds. These were less adventure-focused than Jules Verne's works, and some of them, like particularly The Time Machine, is very much a cautionary tale about what we don't want our future to look like. They're a little bit less wrapped up in the wonders of the scientific possibilities, and more concerned with the drawbacks or the things to be wary of. It was in the 20th century that science fiction really got going as a recognizable genre across multiple forms of media, not just novels, but magazines, movies, TV shows, etc. The 1960s and 70s in particular are sometimes referred to as the golden age of science fiction. This was the era when really well-known science fiction writers were producing their work. Authors like Robert A. Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, and Isaac Asimov. This is also the time when two of the most popular science fiction franchises outside the world of written novels began: Star Wars and Star Trek. The original Star Trek TV series aired from 1966 to 1969, and the first Star Wars movie came out in 1977. I don't think it's a coincidence that people were so interested in reading science fiction stories in the mid-20th century. It was also a time when technology was progressing very quickly, and likewise our scientific understanding of the real world was also advancing rapidly. Especially of note was the Apollo program, NASA's mission to put a man on the moon. The idea of traveling to the moon or other planets was a very prominent theme in 20th century science fiction, and it continues to be today. However, as we learn more about our solar system, the moon and the nearby planets have become less and less mysterious and uncharted territory. So it's less likely nowadays to find science fiction stories that deal with alien civilizations from Mars, or that treat the journey to the moon as something that's never been done before. Because of course it has been. While a lot of science fiction stories do deal with space travel, that's certainly not the only subject matter that can be addressed. Other popular topics include robotics and artificial intelligence, cyborgs, human cloning, dystopian societies. There's really just a huge variety. Science fiction today is often grouped in categories regarding hard science fiction versus soft science fiction. Hard science fiction is more concerned with the science, getting the science right, and giving you the details that prove that the science is right. Whereas soft science fiction often kind of brushes aside scientific details. It's more likely to do things that aren't actually scientifically possible, like faster than light space travel, for instance, and it will bend science to suit the story rather than focus on getting the scientific details right. Another common division is far future versus near future science fiction. Far future takes place very far in the future, as the name would suggest. Something like the Star Trek shows is far future. It takes place centuries from now, in a world that has become very different from the one that we know today. Near future science fiction, on the other hand, takes place not too far in the future, in a world not too different from our own. There might be only one or two major things that make it different, usually the science or technology being explored. Or it might be a dystopian society where it's technically in the future, but society has maybe regressed instead of progressing, like 1984, for instance. Aside from hard versus soft and near future versus far future, there are a lot of subgenres of science fiction based on different story types. Things like dystopian, apocalyptic, or post-apocalyptic fiction, steampunk, cyberpunk, all of the punk genres, space opera, like think Star Wars, alien invasions, stories about robots, stories about human cloning, stories about time travel. Like I said, there's a huge variety within science fiction, but basically, what makes it all a cohesive genre is that it asks what-if questions relating to science and technology. It looks toward the future and it imagines what the future might look like.